tutorial. Beck here from Bell Makes and Mends. Today we're going to be looking at how to make the surgical style face mask, cloth face mask. These are some I prepared earlier. They are open at the top, and that's so that you can put an additional filter in if you want to. The ones I'll be showing you today will not have this top opening, but it's certainly an option that's there for you, and I'll include some instructions in the comments below in how you achieve that. You'll see here there's two ear options. One is the elastic ear loop, the other are the cotton tape ties. Personally, I prefer ties. I feel like I get a better fit, can get it more snug to my face, but it is very much a personal thing, so maybe make one of each and see which you prefer. We're using 2 plies of fabric today. It's a cotton poly blend. So we start with our 2 simple rectangles, one of the outer layer, which I'm using a printed cotton for this mask. That's in part because it's easy for you to see which layer I'm working with. And I've got a plain lining fabric. You can use plain for both, printed for both, whatever you prefer. Now I have found that there's a range of sizes that work for me and for masks. About 11 inches long and between 6 and 7 wide. So this one's 6 inches. I think that's because this is an offcut. The print is an offcut from other masks that I made, that are shaped ones, and it just happened to be the size that we had left. So I've cut those and I've pressed them. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to put in our ear loops or ear elastics or ties. So for elastic ear loops, you're going to cut 2 lengths per mask, and I've found, and again this is personal preference, so you might want to do a bit of trial and error, but I've found that 7 inches long is the right length for me. So I will just measure that out. That's 7. And I'm just going to lean across camera and grab my measuring gauge across the table here. So we're going to be working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which means that you need to place your elastic so that it will be inside, not caught by the seam allowance. So I guess outside of the seam allowance. So I'm going to use my gauge, which I love. And I like to pop it so that the gauge is measuring, I'll just bring that a bit closer, the gauge is measuring a 1/2 inch. So you see the blue line there is at the 1/2 inch mark. So that's my seam allowance. I then pop that here on the fabric, or just alongside the fabric. That's where my seam line is going to go. So then I want to take my elastic and place it just a little bit inside that. Now we're pinning it on the, I've done that wrong. We're going to turn this over. Oof, nearly made a mistake. Let's try again. We're going to pin this to the right side of the outer layer. So here is our 1/2 inch mark. We're going to have it just inside the 1/2 inch mark so that it's nice and close to that edge, but is not caught up in the seam. Pin that in. And then we do the same at the bottom. Now, once you've done a few of these, you might find it's easiest and quickest to do a batch of them at a time rather than doing each one individually. I'm not usually a fan of batch sewing, but for these I find if I do about 6 in a go, or 4, between 4 and 6, I can usually manage without going too stir crazy. Then I have a break and do something else. Alright, so that's our other elastic. Now this fabric, this print is a multi-directional, whoops, I've managed to close that down, so just bring it back to the 1/2 inch. It's a multi-directional print, so there's not really an up or a down, a top or a bottom, which is good because it means you can sort of cut it out, put it together, see how it's looking. With the shaped ones you may have seen, I tend to do a bit of fussy cutting so that the characters are both in the same direction, both up. And I'll show you one of those later to show you what I mean. Alright, so because my lining piece is not exactly the same dimension as my outer piece, and that's because, as I said earlier, I'm sort of using up scraps where I can. I'm going to fold it in half, pop a pin in, so I know that's the halfway mark on my outer piece. Do the same with your lining piece. So we're going to stitch these together right sides facing. So that means the two outside sides are going to be facing each other, and we're going to be working on the wrong side. So just, again, folding it in half, popping a pin in. Then we're going to line up those two pins, and I'll just grab my other. So as I said, these are not quite lining up, they're not quite identical, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap, and I might adjust that in a moment when I put the pins on. So I'm just going to grab some more pins. I've got this really nifty magnetic pin caddy. Can't remember where I got it from, but it's really cool. You can sort of move it around and not worry too much about dropping pins on the floor. So we're going to start by pinning it together in the middle where these two pins line up. Take one out, pop the next one in. Now, it's important to remember that you're going to need an opening to turn it out. I like to use the bottom mostly, but again, as I said, this is a fairly multi-directional print, so it doesn't really matter. I tend to get a bit absent-minded when I'm sewing and just go, so I'm just going to grab some Wonder Clips. So yeah, I tend to just get into the groove when I'm sewing and zip along and suddenly realise that I haven't left an opening. So I find if I use Wonder Clips where I want my opening to be, that's a good little reminder. It jolts me out of the rhythm or the autopilot of sewing. Another trick is if I don't have Wonder Clips, or I don't want to use my Wonder Clips, I'll put 2 pins in instead of the normal one, and that's usually enough to sort of jolt me out of my autopilot. So now we'll go ahead and pin through 3 layers here, so 2 layers of fabric and a layer of elastic. And in this instance, I'm actually going to move this elastic so it's a bit closer to the white lining fabric, but still just over ½ inch away from the edge. So pin that one in. Depending how confident you feel with your sewing, you might want to put another pin in the middle. Also depends on how slippery the fabric is. These cottons are pretty sturdy. They've got a fair bit of friction, so they don't tend to slip too much. But if your fabric is perhaps a bit satiny and you want to hold it in place because it's a bit slippery, you can pop an extra pin or 2 between there. So I've done the top middle, I've done one end with the elastics, now I'm going to do the other end with the elastics, and the bottom I've put the 2 Wonder Clips to remind me to leave a turnout gap. So once again, line that up, shuffle the elastic so it's not quite so much poking out into what will be the seam, because remember you're going to have a seam allowance and it's going to go from where the white fabric is, not from the patterned fabric. Smooth it out again, just pin. I'll pop a couple more pins in the top here. So here we are with our second mask. Again, it's the Doctor Who fabric and it's the same lining fabric, but this time instead of elastic ear loops, we're going to use a cotton tape to make ties to go around the back of the head. Now again, through a little bit of experimentation, I've worked out that I like these ties to be between 14 and 15 inches. And you can see I'm using my, I'll just turn the camera a little, I'm actually using my cutting mat to measure the length. I'm just going to pick up the camera, show you a little bit more closely. So hold tight, a little bit of queasy cam coming. So you can see here with my cutting mat, I've got the measurements along bottom. And that's in part why I work in inches, even though I am a relatively young Australian and mostly use metric, because my cutting mat and my rulers quilting ruler are all in inches. I've found that for these types of projects where I'm just doing fairly simple shapes and lengths, it's been easiest to just work it out in inches and use that. But I will provide in the comments the conversions. So I'll just snip that. I'll just put the camera back. Change the angle a little. Whoops, don't fall. Don't fall. Okay. Try not to fall over on me, okay? So, snip that. 15 inches. Now, I mean, obviously the ties need to be longer because they're going around, all the way around the back of your head, not just over your ears. 15 inches I find also gives me a bit of flexibility if I want to just do the ties straight to the back of my head, or if I want to add an angle or a crossover. And we're going to need 4 of these because you have 2 on each side, unlike the elastics where they loop, so you only need 1 on each side. So there we go, pop that back in my work in progress box. So I don't know if we've spoken before about storing projects. I like to use boxes and baskets to store my works in progress. In here I've got, oh, that doesn't belong in there actually. I've got some elastic, my twill tape sits in here. I've got some masks that I've cut out previously and haven't yet put together. Some different elastics. Oh, an empty ribbon. That can probably go in the recycling. A few bits and pieces. And there's my tape. So that way, it's easy to put it away, but it's also easy to grab it all out together. Keeps everything together. Means that when I'm working on a project, I'm not constantly looking for my notions and materials. So, similar process with the ties, but as I said, we're going to have 2 on each side. And again, putting them on the outside of the front layer, setting our little gauge to a 1/2 inch. Now, if you don't have a gauge, you can of course use a ruler. So again, I've got this lovely transparent quilting ruler that I quite like. So I'll pop that here. I might put a bit of white card underneath actually to make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. Here we go, a bit of cardboard. So you can see that all right. Let me just come a bit closer to the camera. Oops, sorry. So, using the ruler, there's the 1 inch point. So I know I want my seam to be a 1/2 inch, and I know I want this to show you with inside that ruler here on this bit of white cardboard. Another way, if you don't have a gauge, then you can use a ruler. It doesn't have to be a quilting ruler. It could be a school ruler. Any ruler really will do, as long as you know how wide your seam's going to be. So a 1/2 inch seam is going to be, I don't know, I'll have to work it out and let you know. So it's going to be about 1 and a bit centimetres. So you're going to line up the end of your ruler with the end of your fabric. This dotted line here is where the seam allowance will be. And then I find with these in particular, it's easiest if I line up roughly the middle of my tape with the 1 inch mark. So it's going to be about 1/4 of an inch between the seam and the tie, and I find that's usually a good length. Okay, so continuing to just pin our ear ties in place using that 1 inch spot as our marker. And making sure you're only at this stage pinning it to the outer layer of the fabric. So again, lining this up at the bottom now, and then up to the 1 inch in mark. And then I like to just fold them so that they're both poking out the bottom. Now, I was saying earlier about how with the ear elastic one, sometimes I get a bit carried away and might forget to leave a turnout hole. Not so much of a problem with these ones because you'll have your ties hanging out the bottom. So that's another good visual reminder. So lining that up with the middle of the 1 inch mark. So again, folding these so they come down the middle here. Now at this point, I find it useful to grab a wonder clip. So a wonder clip. Or sometimes I use one of these little hair clips, little hinged hair clip. And I like to clip all 4 tie ends together. And that just helps me keep track of where they are and makes it less likely that I'm going to catch them in the seam. So again, we'll just fold this in half to find the middle, pop a pin in, same with our lining piece, fold it in half lengthways, lengthways? Is that what, yeah, anyway, fold it in half that way, short ends together. You can see that's quite skew. If actually I might trim that while I've got it here. Now the nice thing with making these masks is they don't have to be perfectly square or perfectly rectangular, because you're going to be wearing them on your face and your face is round. So, you know, don't get too upset if you're not cutting straight lines the way that you would like to. You will not be assessed on the straightness of your edges on this project. So again, as we did with the other one, lining up our middle points, pinning them together, pinning through 3 layers here, pinning through 3 layers here. Might just bring this in a little. And as you can see, we've got our ends here through the bottom, so I'll just pop a couple of pins. I might use wonder clips again actually. I like my wonder clips. I get my wonder clips from Ruby Jam. I'll include my affiliate link in the notes. I think you can also get them on eBay. I like to support Australian businesses where I can. I know that Ruby Jam is a good supplier. They also have quite a good rewards system. So for every $1 you spend at Ruby Jam, you earn a point, and they also offset their carbon footprint by planting trees for every order they send out. So that's one of my favourite suppliers, and I'll supply my affiliate link in the notes. So let's move over to the sewing machine. I've got my machine threaded. I've got a dark blue in the bobbin and I've got a white in the top, and that's because I'm going to be sewing the mask this way with the white lining fabric on top and the darker printed fabric on the bottom, and the blue is a nice colour that will blend in with that fairly busy print. Now you can make these either on your sewing machine or your overlocker. Really the only difference is that if you're using your sewing machine, you might want to trim your seams when you're done before you turn it inside out. On the overlocker, obviously that is not necessary. Either way, we're going to be using the 1/2 inch seam allowance, which on my machine is there. Now, if you've watched my videos before, you might remember that I have a little bit of tape here on the removable part of my foot. So this whole base of my machine, I should say, this whole section pulls out, and I can either have just this narrow part if I'm doing something narrow like hemming a sleeve, or I can put in my large flatbed if I'm doing a larger project. But for most sewing, this is a pretty good setup. Now, I find it easiest to use this 1/2 inch guide here, which is this edge of the pink tape, to guide it through. So I look at here, and I also look at this line here. Regular straight stitch, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and away we go. Now again, you don't need to get too precious about your 1/2 inch allowance here. You stop with the needle down. If the needle's not down, you use your hand wheel to crank it. Foot up, spin around 90 degrees. Now, that's pretty close, but if it was too close, if I'd gone too far this way, I could just do a couple of back stitches. So I would spin it back and do the back stitches. If I hadn't come far enough, I might use my hand wheel and crank it forward a stitch or two. So foot up, 90 degrees, foot down. Now we're going to take this pin out, but we've got to remember that this is the elastic wedged or sandwiched in between the two layers. So we want to make sure that doesn't move around too much. You can do that by holding onto it with your finger, or if you have a stiletto tool, which is a really nifty tool I got at a quilting fair, you can pop that down to apply a bit of pressure. So pin out. Now what have I done with my little magnet? Another little tip is I have a magnet which I sit here and I can just drop my pins on because the larger one doesn't really fit well on the bed of my machine. So here we go again, down the short side. Now again we're coming to this second pin, so again I'm going to make sure I hold the elastic in place. Might slow down. Now if you're really worried about the elastic moving, you can use your hand crank like this to go forward very slowly, and when the needle has caught the very edge of your elastic, which you'll feel because you'll feel the resistance, then you can take your pin out. Just be careful that you're not going to sew over your pin if you're using this approach. So again, we've come to the end of our edge. Machine stopped, needle down, foot up, rotate 90 degrees. Now I can see here that my elastic is quite close to my foot, so I'm actually just going to pop my finger in. Actually, I'm going to use my stiletto, but you could use it with your finger as well, or a needle, or blunt end of your closed scissors, and I'm just going to sort of, actually I'm going to use my fingers, just sort of push that a little bit out of the way because I don't want to accidentally catch the bottom edge of that elastic in this seam. Alright, so here we go. So this is the long top edge that we're doing now. Here we go. One of the reasons I like to use the magnet on the base of my machine is, as you may have noticed, I don't really need to stop and look where I'm putting the pin. As long as it's in my peripheral vision, I can see it's going in the direction of the magnet. Most of the time it'll get caught, so I don't tend to end up with pins scattered all over the place. So because I've turned it this way and the front of the foot is pretty much holding the elastic in place now, I can take that pin out, hold it down with my left finger, or as I said, you can use a tool if you want. Again, I'm just going to readjust that elastic a little bit. Here we go again. Tool or finger to hold the elastic in place. Pin comes out. Hand crank the needle down. Now in some projects, if you're applying elastic or tape ties, you might go back and forth over the spot where you've attached the elastic. You can do that, but I find it's not necessary because we're going to top stitch the whole thing and that'll hold it in place. So I've found I haven't needed that, oops, don't take that off yet. I don't need that reinforcement, but you can if you want to. Alright, so now remembering that this is here to remind me I need to stop. And once you get to that point, if you want to, you can back stitch a little. Again, it's not strictly necessary because we will be top stitching. So then what you'll do is you will trim away the seam allowance, you'll clip your corners. I'll just quickly show you clipping the corners. So that's at an angle like this. That makes it nicer and easier to turn out that corner when we're turning it around. So just showing you again. And of course, if you're doing an overlocker, you don't need to worry about trimming the corners. So when you're trimming the seam, you will trim away a little bit of the elastic that's there in the seam allowance. That's okay. That's fine. That is part of what we've taken into account when we've done our 7-inch ear elastic. So we've allowed a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So it actually comes out to be a bit shorter, about 6 inches once it's actually all stitched together. Just trim away our thread ends. Oops, bit of fraying. Now I've not trimmed the seam on the bottom, and that's in part because I want to keep this part so I can, when we turn it inside out and then fold it over to in case we've got something to stitch together. Obviously in an overlocker you will not have this seam allowance. If you want to, you can trim away the seam allowance, but I would recommend tapering it out about 1 centimetre or a 1/2 inch before the end of the stitching. So if I was going to do it, I would probably trim along here to about this point, which is a little bit in from the end of the sewing, and then I would probably do an angle, and I'd probably do it in this direction, so I've got a bit of extra fabric to play with. So now we turn it inside out, and look, here are our ear loops which have been safely tucked in. You want to gently poke out the corners. I use a knitting needle. A lot of people use a chopstick. Some people do use the blunt end of the scissors. I prefer not to. That's just a personal preference. But whatever you do, do it gently and carefully so that you're not poking through the stitching. So you want to sort of, I kind of do a little sideward motion like this and just sort of tease it out rather than a poking motion. So just a little gentle rubbing motion from side to side just to get that corner turned out nicely. And you'll see that there we go. And you'll see that the elastic is close to, but not quite at the edge of the mask. So again, we do that at the bottom and the bottom. Alright, so I'm going to stitch together the second mask, being very careful not to stitch over the ties. So just a quick reminder, the ties are hanging down the bottom, and as I go along each long edge, I'm being careful not to catch them in the stitching. I'm going to go ahead and do that and turn this out. Then I'm going to press both the masks, and then I will come back and show you how to do the pleats in the mask. So here we are. I've got our two masks here, one with the loops, one with the ties. I can take off this clip now, don't really need that anymore, not really at risk of catching those ties in my sewing, and we're going to give them a quick press. So we've turned them out, we've used our chopstick or our knitting needle or whatever pen, whatever implement you've used to turn out your corners. I'm going to give it a nice press. When you're pressing the mask at this stage, you want to be sure that you've got folded in the seam allowance where the gap is, the turning gap. That'll give you a nice clean finish when you come to finish off your project, because you'll be stitching closer to the edge of the fabric, so within the seam allowance. So we won't be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance when we do the top stitching, we'll be using something more like 1/8. So you want that nice and flat and smooth. Now we're going to put 3 folds or 3 pleats into these masks. So this is the point at which you want to decide which is your top and which is your bottom. So as I said, most of the time I have the opening at the bottom. but because it's a multi-directional print, you might just want to have a little play with it and make sure it looks okay. So to start off with, I'm going to fold it in half this way. I'm going to press along here to put that crease in. Now, this is the way I have found is easiest for me to manipulate the fabric and to create these pleats. If you have a different way you want to do it, if you want to measure it, if you're more of a measuring person, go for it by all means. But the goal is to have 3 pleats in the mask, all going in the same direction. I find it best if they're all going down. So that's the halfway point. So then what I do is I pinch it. Actually, I probably could have. Let me press it the other way. Probably should have done it that way. So I pinch it, and then I fold it down about a thumb width. See how I'm just using my thumb and folding down. And then pressing. And then again, about halfway. So for me, I've got fingers here, middle finger here, thumb here, pinching, folding down. And you sort of finesse it as you go. It doesn't have to be exact because most of the time it will pop out when you're wearing it. You're going to fan it out to cover your nose, your mouth and your chin. So you just want it to sit nicely. It doesn't have to be precise. It doesn't, in my opinion, have to be exact. And then same here, we're going to pinch it and fold it. This is quite a small pleat at the bottom. Now you might just want to stop at 2. Have a go, see how you like it. As I say, I have found the most effective is 3. It just sits nicely on the face, or at least on my face. And you know, my face is going to be different to yours. That's just the way life is. Because if we all had identical faces, it would be very much like an episode of Doctor Who. So again, you can use pins or you can use your wonder clips to pop these pleats in place. They're all going in the same direction, and for this instance, they're all going down. We'll just see if we can line that up a little bit more. So try and get this to be a straight line if you can. But again, don't spend too much time lining it up. If it's not exact, it's okay. One more clip. No, I've left my clips on the other side of the room, so we'll use a pin. So again, lining it up, pinning it in. Now, if you're going to use pins, I find the easiest way to do it is to do it at 90 degrees to the seam. So in this case, it's along the pleat. So here we go. Repeat for the other mask. So again, work out our top and our bottom. I think that's going to be nice with the little Dalek head facing up. So in half, press, pleat down. Now you see I'm just readjusting because it didn't seem to be quite even, which is probably because my rectangle is not strictly rectangular. So pleat. Now with this one, you want to try and keep your pleats inside where your ties are. So because the tie is a bit wider, I'll just show you. So the elastic is more narrow and the tie is wider. So you do lose a little bit. You lose a little bit of space on your mask for this pleating part. So I find it best if your pleat sits under your top tie. Press that down. Oops. And again at the bottom, you want your pleat to come down to about where that top tie that bottom tie starts. It's overlapping a little bit, that's okay. Alright, so I'll pin those down and then we'll top stitch them. So I've got my machine threaded now with white both on the top and the bottom, because that's just easier. Popping the mask here, so as I said, this is where the gap, the turning out gap starts. So I've just popped a pin there. I've just got the one pin in plus the clips holding the pleats in place because I really feel that's all I need for this. And I'm going to line up, so it gets a bit tricky here, I'm going to line up the edge of the mask with this line here on my foot, on my base, and also you can see there's like a little line here on my foot, which is where the clear part stops and the metal part starts. And just having a look, I'm also going to move my needle to the right, so using my slider, I'm going to move it over to the 6 position. No, actually I'm going to make it the 5 position. That looks good. So that gives me a really nice narrow little seam, which will be enough to catch all the edges, but won't go too far into the mask. But when I get to the short sides, I am going to be a bit further out, so I'm going to have a wider seam allowance here. I'll show you that when I get there. So here we go. Again, just the straight stitch. So not going too fast, slowing down and being a little bit careful when we come to where these pleats come close to the foot. Now you will notice that the mask looks very narrow at this point. That's because you've got all your pleats in, but remember they will fan out when you're wearing them. So I'm going to stop about there. So that's again about our 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance from this edge into where this seam will be. I find that that's useful for helping the mask keep its shape and the pleats sit nicely. Also, it means that I can manoeuvre the foot and the fabric without it getting too caught up in the pleats. So needle down, foot up, rotate 90 degrees. Now before we put the foot down, we're going to just flatten out all our pleats, pop the foot down. So actually that's more than our 1/2 inch. That is actually 1.6 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch. So that's all. Oh, actually no, I might go a little bit further. So what I might do is I might take this wonder clip out because it's in my way. I'm going to use my hand crank to just do 2 or 3 more stitches. Needle down, foot up, turn it around. Nope, still on a few more. So we want to be close enough too that we catch the end of our elastic in top stitching. So there we go, that's closer to our 1/2 inch. So again, flattening out your pleats, so sit nicely, popping down your foot. Now again, you might want to use your hand. I find because it's such a little sewing length, my hand is fine, or you might want to use your stiletto, or you might want to use your sewing scissors closed just to hold everything in place and gently feed it through. So nice and gentle, slow and steady as we go over these pleats, because you're now going to be sewing through several layers of fabric. So nice and slow. Sometimes you might need to pause with your needle down, foot up, and just kind of rearrange, make sure everything's lining up nicely. There we go, foot up, 90 degrees, lining up the edge of your mask with the line on your base and the edge of where the clear and the metal foot meet. Same thing at this end. Pleats obviously going in the opposite direction here. So not so much of a risk that they're going to get tangled up. nicely. Whoops. Sometimes if it gets a bit bogged down in the layers, you can just needle up, foot up, and just push it forward ½ millimetre or so, just enough to overcome the bump. Being careful not to stretch out your elastic, you can gently guide it, but try not to stretch it out. And here you can see the tails from where we started. So I'm going to go back to that spot. And just a little reverse to secure the end. Now at this point, if you want to, you can do another row of stitching down the short sides, just to give it a bit of extra stability and security. And if you're going to do a second row, I suggest that you go nice and close to the edge to make sure you catch those elastics. Come on. So you can see already when I've been manipulating, turning the fabric around, it's fanned out, so it's come back to its original width, but because I've stitched down this side, it stayed nice and narrow on the edge, which is what we want to see. Just a little reverse stitch over all 4 anchor points of the elastic so it's nice and secure. Trim off our threads, and then the final thing, the final step for this mask is to give it another press, tidy up any loose threads, and you're ready to go. With your mask, if you're using the cotton ties, you will need to finish off the ends so they don't fray. You can tie a knot or you can stitch them down. So I'm going to just fold it over a little and then fold it again so the end is encased. Now it's a bit fiddly, a bit tricky. I might stuff it up. Let's see what happens. So again, I'm going to use my tweezers for this. But you can use again the end of your scissors or your stiletto. You could use your fingers, but it's a bit tricky. Now I want to put this, I've still got my needle way over in the 5 position. In fact, I'm going to move it to 7. I'm going to use my hand crank. Yep, that's caught the end of that. And I've started in the middle, and that is to reduce the risk that the end of this edge of the tape is going to get sucked down into the feed dogs. I'm also going to, with my left hand, gently pull on these tail threads in the direction that I'm sewing. And these steps together should, actually I might use my right hand because it's so little, use my left hand to guide it through, should prevent it from getting sucked into the feed dog. Let's see how we go. Nice and slow on the foot pedal. You could use the hand crank if you wanted to. There we go, couple of stitches. Needle down, foot up, turn 180 degrees in this occasion, and then we're going to go back the way we came. I seem to have come off the edge here, so just going to use my tweezers to feed it through. So I just am raising the foot there. I'm just going to rearrange it a little because I don't want the edge of the tape, this part of the tape here, to get caught in this part of the foot and get bulked up. So let's see how we go. That looks pretty good to me. A few stitches to end it up. So there we go. You can see that we've stitched that in a little self-enclosed sandwich. Trim off the tails. So by starting it in the middle, you are less likely to end up having all your threads and your tape sucked down into the feed dogs, which can be both frustrating and not super for your machine. So you're going to do that on all four ends, and then again give your mask a little press and you're good to go. This is my second tie, and I've done a slightly better job this time. So I've managed to stop the needle while it's still in the tape, so raising my foot, spinning it around 180 degrees, and because the needle is still in the tape, it's a bit easier to manage that. So we go back the other way. Now look, this is fiddly, you might want to practice. Don't worry if you mess it up. You can always tie a knot in it. There we go. You might want to practice on some scraps before doing it on your actual mask. Again, don't let perfection be the enemy of done. It is better to have a mask with slightly mangled, dodgy looking ends to the tape than no mask at all. And each one you do, you'll get better. So a final press. Make sure those pleats are nicely formed. And there you are. A surgical style 3-pleat face mask in 2-ply cloth. One with elastic loops, one with cloth ties. Thank you so much for joining me in this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, this has been Beck from Bell Makes and Mends.